It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor David Healy. He is a professor in the Department of Family Medicine at McMaster University, having previously been a professor of psychiatry at Bangor and Cardiff. He is former secretary of the British Association for Psychopharmacology and author of over 220 peer-reviewed articles, 250 other pieces and 24 books. And I shall not even attempt to list all his books here, but I'm sure you will all have heard of Let Them Eat Prozac by New York University Press. Now, Professor Healy is no stranger to controversy, scientific controversy, I should say, having raised awareness of how pharmaceutical companies sell drugs by marketing diseases and co-opting academic opinion leaders and ghostwriting their articles. And we look forward, Professor Healy, to your lecture entitled The Standardization of Psychiatry and all the challenges you will put before us.
Okay, usually when people begin talks, they say something like, it's good to be here. Well, I think I'd prefer to be there. I'm 3,500 miles away from all of you. I'm over near Toronto at the moment. And one of the features of the talks that you're going to get today is that at least a few of us have been in the business for a while and are probably looking to history in a sense to make sense of what we've been through. Over 30 years ago, I began here in the North Wales Hospital, which you see here. And this is the kind of place that gave psychiatry a bit of a bad name. It was a backwater. And this is rather odd in a sense, in that psychiatry was the first medical specialty. It was the first to have specialist hospitals. It was the first to have specialist journals. It was the first to do EBM. And by EBM, I mean looking at the data in order to work out what's best for patients. And this was Philippe Pinel back around 1809. What I'm going to take you into in this talk is some other firsts that we've, that I think we may well end up becoming famous for, or maybe even infamous for. Let's begin after World War II, when there's a changing climate. Up till then, the dominant form of psychiatry had been German psychiatry, but after World War II, this went into decline. In the United States, the psychiatrists there turned to Freud and essentially wrote themselves out of the script for almost 30 or 40 years. So that left people in the UK who spoke English, fortunately, to become fairly magisterial figures on the global mental health stage. 1954 was a key year. That was the year chlorpromazine came to the UK. And most of the clinical trials and most of the early psychotropic drugs were done in the UK. And a key person behind that was the man you see here, Michael Shepard. He was a key impetus to the whole thing. But equally, we had a major figure in the anti-psychiatry movement too in the UK. And the tension between these two poles brought in 1968 a bunch of explosions around the world that look rather like the kind of protests that we're seeing now. What you see here on the far right is students and workers out in the streets of Paris. And they're awfully concerned that the new drugs and the new techniques we have to evaluate drugs like RCTs, the question was, well, are they enhancing us or are they diminishing us? And the answer in Paris was, we're very worried that they're diminishing us. And the students are marching, perhaps not on this particular day, but they do march to the offices of Jean Delay, the discoverer of chlorpromazine, and ransack his office. So let me move on. I mentioned RCTs. Here's Tony Hill. And he's the man who runs the first RCT of streptomycin for tuberculosis, 1948. There had actually been a much better clinical trial of streptomycin for tuberculosis before the first RCT. It had found out more about the drug, like for instance, there's hazards to it that hadn't turned up in the RCT. Very few people used RCT for almost 20 years after Hill's RCT. But here you see him talking in 1965. And some of the first things he says in this talk from which the quote comes is that actually, it's quite extraordinary. Nobody was using RCTs for a while, but now everybody's using them. And in particular, what's really amazing is that the people who seem most keen on them are the pharmaceutical industry. They're there persuading doctors to pay heed to the results of RCTs when doctors aren't paying heed to them. The other thing he says is that RCTs aren't very good to evaluate drugs, which you can see in this quote. They're a good way to look at one thing a drug does, but drugs can do several thousand things. And what we're looking at is using an RCT to evaluate one thing that the drug does, and they can only evaluate one thing at a time. That's what they're designed for. And therefore, by definition, they're not a good way to evaluate drugs. It's now clear that the reason RCTs had come on stream just before Hill gave this talk was that they'd been incorporated into the 1962 Food and Drugs Act by a man called Louis Lasagna. This followed the birth defects caused by thalidomide, and the idea was we need to get companies to prove that their drugs work. So let me move you on to the next slide. When Hill was doing RCTs, or when anyone was doing clinical trials pretty well during the 1940s and 50s, they were looking at antibiotics and drugs like that, which save lives and get people back to work. Within mental health, there are no clinical trials we have ever done that show that these drugs save lives or get people back to work. We look at surrogate outcome measures like the Hamilton Rating Scale for depression. And you can run trials of the antidepressants like the SSRIs and the antipsychotics on which there are more dead people in the active treatment arm than at the trials, but you show a rating scale change that you want to see, and we can then declare and do declare that these drugs work. So work is an ambiguous word here, but Hamilton, whom you see here, is interested in another ambiguity to the use of scales, which is that they introduce a standardization into the encounters between us and the patients we see. This can be good and bad, and it's a thing that we don't really pay much heed to, but it's caught in the cartoon that you see here. For the people who run health services these days, it's an axiom of truth that rating scales for interviews are going to give much more valid results than just a free-floating interview where a doctor uses their intuition. But in fact, using rating scales standardizes the interview, and rather than helping us to help patients live the life that they want to live, it involves us in helping them to live the life that Pfizer and GSK want them to live. At this time, in '68, when the students were out on the street, they weren't concerned about big pharma. There was no such thing as big pharma. They were concerned about big medicine. Here on the left, you see Alan Broadhurst, who worked for Geigy Pharmaceuticals and was the person who helped introduce the anti-depressant group of drugs to the UK and probably wrote the Hamilton checklist. On the right, you see George Beaumont, who did pretty much the same, also working for Geigy for clomipramine and OCD. For the most part, we saw the work these people did and the educational efforts that they helped support as being a good thing, rather than the disease mongering that we might see it as now. The other thing in the late 1960s was that when patients on back wards who couldn't advocate for themselves had problems on the drugs we gave them, drugs that we thought were rather like the COVID vaccines, life-saving, and we didn't really want anyone to say anything bad about them, but we were still able to recognize the adverse effects these drugs caused. We now have comparable syndromes to the tardive dyskinesia you see here. In post-SSRI sexual dysfunction, for instance, or protracted withdrawal symptoms after antidepressants are antipsychotics. And even though these are happening to lots of people out in the public domain who are able to advocate for themselves, who get in touch with the media, Well, when the media come and ask us our view, we say, no, these things aren't happening. We get in the way of the recognition that the problems, the treatments we give could be causing. As of 1980, so, and for possibly 10 years after that, our core business was schizophrenia. Now, one of the interesting things here is that schizophrenia is vanishing. Like any real illness, it came and it's going. In the same way, postpartum psychosis, classic postpartum psychosis, as opposed to what often gets called postpartum psychosis now, vanished, and mother and baby units have closed across the UK as a consequence. But very few people are saying, what's going on here? I mean, you know, it should be of interest to us when an illness disappears, just as much as it's of interest to us when something like the COVID virus turns up. This is interesting, but equally, we should be interested when things disappear, but we're not. Okay, so there's a big change around 1980. And let me take you to the advert on the left-hand side first. In the UK, we paid no heed to DSM-3, other than you had people saying, well, it's got this strange new illness called panic disorder. This is probably just the Americans rediscovering something that we in Europe have known for a long time and called by a different name. And there were jokes about it being Upjohn illness. Upjohn's drug, which you see here, didn't ever really make it in the UK. But let me go back to DSM-3. The impetus to DSM-3 came in 1974. The working parties were set up in 1976, and Bob Spitzer was very clear that they were going to adopt an operational framework for illnesses. This is a word very few of us had heard about. Some of us heard that there was people like Carl Hempel, who had been writing about this kind of thing for a long time, but didn't really understand what was involved. What's involved essentially is just we were going to produce a checklist, rather like the Hamilton rating checklist, you know, for things you need to remember to check for before you say a person has an illness or not. It was a standardization that we were turning to in a way that we hadn't done before. As the alprazolam advert in the previous slide hints at, the benzodiazepines were still big in 1980. They began to run into trouble during the 80s, and this advert seems sinister now. It looked good when it was actually produced first, but we all know that, well, Ativan's dangerous. So we came to learn that it was dangerous. And behind this, Big Pharma begins to come into the frame. Let me explain. One of the first things is that during the 1980s, controversies blew up about the benzodiazepine group of drugs. And there seemed to be a degree of continuity between the anti-psychiatry of the 1960s and what was happening during the 1980s, except in the case of the benzodiazepines, you had figures from the establishment who were saying, look, there are real hazards here and we need to take them into account. And the people whom they were advocating for were ordinary people who were on the benzodiazepines. These were not people who were out in the street marching to change the world. The other feature, or another feature of the whole thing, was that the media come into play here. Without the program you see here on the left, the That's Life program, the benzodiazepine crisis couldn't have ever become a crisis. Now, in the early 80s, health rarely featured in the media at all, other than signal events like the first heart transplant. But by the end of the 80s, every newspaper, every periodical had its health page. And by the 90s, health was featuring on the front pages of most newspapers, and often you could have 2 or 3 health stories on the front page. And this fits in with something else, which was the word risk. In 1970, in healthcare or related journals, there was only 200 articles that had the word risk in the title or the abstract of the article. By 1990, there were 20,000 articles. Health had discovered risk. Now, around the late 1980s, Ulrich Beck's book, Risk Societies, comes out. And the reaction to that in Europe and the UK and the United States was to become more aware of man-made risks, that we might pose more threat to ourselves than nature posed to us. And this led to a pushback against nuclear power. It led to the green movement and awareness of climate change. But in healthcare, we had discovered risk before Beck or before anyone else. And the answer within healthcare was to not try and get chemicals out of the environment, but to consume more chemicals and more techniques for blood pressure, for asthma, for bone densities, for nervous problems, or whatever. The volume of pills being taken began to increase dramatically. I said we discovered risk before the wider world discovered risk. We also discovered neoliberalism before the wider world. In 1976, well, probably the 80s, you have neoliberalism, which is essentially taking a single target like the money supply or the inflation level and treating the country based on that, saying this is the one key thing we're going to do. And if the country falls apart while we're doing it, well, that's okay, we're doing the right thing. In healthcare, since the 1960s, we'd been doing the same thing, which was rather than treating the patient in front of us and treating the problems they brought to us, we were treating their blood pressure figures, or their blood sugar, or their rating scale scores, regardless of how the patient in front of us fared. We had stopped taking risks. I mean, neoliberalism supposedly is all about making us all entrepreneurial, but in fact, if you look at healthcare, it becomes clear we had stopped trying to help people live the lives they wanted to live, and we were much more in the business of getting them to fit into risk management programs that we had, rather than helping them. Follow the science, which you hear a lot these days from people like Joe Biden, isn't about following the science or helping people, or trying to empower people. It's about trying to constrain people. And it shouldn't be. That's not actually what it ought to be about. But the lure of checklists to managers is just too strong for them to resist. They think taking out the clipboard and ticking the boxes gives a much more quality relationship than encountering the person there in front of them. It's for management and industry generally, quality outcomes are ones that are the same every single time, rather than the meeting between you and a patient or whoever, or just any two people being a good meeting. The Greeks were aware of this issue 2,000 years ago and aware of the foolishness of wanting to turn everything you touch into gold. It's a way to kill humanity. So the end of the 80s, the start of the 1990s, the pharmaceutical industry has become awfully big at this stage, and it's about to become even bigger on the back of the SSRIs. In the UK, up till 1990, we had been anxious and nervous, and we had nervous breakdowns. Now we're all about to become depressed. We were going to become, as this Guardian article on the inside says, a low serotonin people, no less. So in the late 1980s, on the advice of management consultants, the NHS began to outsource ancillary staff like cleaning staff. In the mid to late 1970s, on the advice of management consultants, the pharmaceutical industry began to outsource clinical trials to contract research organizations, now a $40 billion business, and they're the ones that run the trials for industry. They began to outsource the writing of clinical trial results to medical writing companies, ghostwriting companies. They began to outsource drug development to biotech companies. They now outsource public relations to groups like Sense About Science and to the Science Media Center, who are probably helping support this meeting. This is all operationalism in action also. Some of the consequences you see here, this slide is taken from a brochure produced by a company coordinating the articles on Pfizer's SSRI Zoloft. And what you see here is the PTSD page. And you see in the middle there under the word status that there have been 2 trials done in PTSD. They're both negative, and there have been 2 previous trials also negative, but they're going to be written up as positive. They're going to appear in the best journals in the field, the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. And over on the left, you see TBD, to be determined. The papers have been written. It's going to be down to Pfizer's marketing department who the authors will be, and the authors won't necessarily be people who've been involved in the trial, but they'll be people who the company thinks will be good to market Zoloft. Neither the names in the authorship line, nor the people who ran the trial, nor the ghostwriters, nor the FDA or MHRA will have seen the data from these trials. So on the back of all these trials who have been done, and on the back of all the publications, every single trial on average of a non-patent drug, at least in mental health, gives rise to 50 scientific publications, almost all written by ghostwriters. But on the back of this, we got the idea that we could have evidence-based medicine and we could have guidelines about what people should do. But the NICE guidelines, as I'm sure you know, are all based on ghost-written articles. There's no access to the trial data. NICE do not have access to the data from the trials, which may often be negative trials, but are published as positive. So I've written to NICE and MHRA and EMA and FDA and the FBI and everyone, all the major journals, all the politicians, the ministers of health in all of the departments of health in the Western European archipelago. That's England and Ireland, for those of you who weren't sure what it is. And they all agree that the literature is ghostwritten and there's no access to the clinical trial data. Their response is to take the escape route that I offered them, which is it's not our job to police the medical literature, raising the question of whose job is it? And this is an area in which psychiatry leads the way. I'm going to take you to a key date in our history, which is September 20th, 1991. And this is the day that an article comes out in the BMJ and the FDA have a hearing in response to a classic medical article that has come out the year before, saying we've had 6 patients who've gone on Prozac and become suicidal. You know, the problem cleared up when the drug dose was reduced or the drug was halted and came back if we re-expose people to the drug. This was solid evidence that Prozac can make some people suicidal. But the response from the company was to turn to evidence-based medicine and meta-analyze their clinical trials, which the BMJ published on the day of the FDA hearing. And both FDA and BMJ were happy with the idea that there was no increased risk on Prozac here at all, even though if you look at the published article, there's an increased number of suicidal events on Prozac compared to placebo, but these were not statistically significant. If you look at the article more closely, you'll see there's a footnote, and in the footnote, it becomes clear that Lilly did, they breached FDA and regulatory and more general regulations by miscoding one of the events. And when you reverse the miscoding, what do you know? There's a statistically significant increase in suicidal events on Prozac compared to placebo in Lilly's trials. But based on all this, FDA decided not to warn about this risk. And as a consequence, journals changed. They stopped taking standard medical literature up till then, which was the only literature for which we've got access to the data, that is case reports. We stopped getting the drugs bulletins, which had talked about the harms of drugs, and we got guidelines instead, which only talk about the benefits. The harms of drugs began to vanish, and patients found it increasingly difficult to raise these things with us because they knew we were going to look at the evidence base, which said, you know, there isn't any problem. Therefore, if you think you have a problem, it's all in your head. The problem when patients vanish is that we vanish too, because managers don't see us dealing with poisons out of which we're trying to bring good, and there's a real risk that things can go wrong. They see drugs that work wonderfully well and have no problems at all, and we're expensive prescribers, and nurses and pharmacists could do the job just as well. Couldn't they? So if a patient comes in to you and says, look, I'm not able to make love anymore. I halted the drug ages ago and I still can't make love, or I've become suicidal on this drug. The first scientific task all of us has is to try and work out, well, what's happening here? And if you become persuaded, as I did around this time, that what the patients were saying was right, that, when they said, Doc, I've been suicidal before and I've been depressed before, but this was different and it changed when I lowered the dose of the pill, that actually the pill in their case was causing a problem. That's the first scientific task we have. The next one then is, if there's a mismatch between that and what appears to be the evidence base, our task is to find out, why is there a mismatch? And the answer in the case of the SSRIs and sexual dysfunction after you've halted the drugs are becoming suicidal is that the entire literature is ghostwritten. There's no access to the clinical trial data where these problems appeared. The regulators haven't seen the clinical trial data. No one has. When you get to see the clinical trial data, you find that people in these trials had exactly the same problems that your patients are now reporting to you. So,
David, we have 3 minutes left.
oh, great. I'll have to move awfully quickly then. So we used to be good at getting patients to take responsibility for their own lives. We now need to take responsibility for our own prescribing. And here you see Louis Lasagna, who, in response to the idea that only clinical trials show what drugs do, is saying, well, actually, that's only in the clinical trials are only sophisticated in the sense. Now, he's the man who introduced clinical trials to us, sophisticated in the sense that they embody adulterations. But actually, your interview with patients can be more worldly wise and fun than any clinical trial. We've moved from a world where drugs were poisons and the art of medicine was to bring good out of their use, to drugs being sacraments, which can only do good. They have no harms linked to them. We've moved from a world where we were specialists to a world where we're partialists. As a family doctor colleague of mine told me recently, that, I can refer people to a gastroenterologist, cardiologist, respirologist, and I'll get reports back sometimes that, there is no heart problem or respiratory problem here. But if I refer to a psychiatrist, I'll never be told the patient's normal. And a further problem in terms of the adverse effects drugs cause, apart from the no access to the data and the clinical trial literature being ghostwritten, is the fact they're likely to get patients back on such an enormous cocktail of drugs. It's now very hard for that reason to establish what the drug, which drug is actually causing the problem. So in 2002, Labour introduced an NHS plan which envisaged replacing doctors with nursing staff. And here's a periodical in the United States from 2004 saying the same thing. And we have moved to training, which you could call low salt doctors, who are more interested in appraisal and things like that, rather than establishing whether a drug is causing an adverse effect or not. We don't train doctors to establish these things these days. Here's the last slide, and this is the best way to summarize things up. Before 1990, there have been 15 trials done, RCTs, in children who are depressed with antidepressants, all negative. After 1990, there were 30 trials done, all negative. Even the 2 trials in which Prozac was approved were negative. GSK applied to get paroxetine approved, and FDA said, we will approve it, even though we agree with you that your 3 trials in children who are depressed were negative. And we agree with you as well that it wouldn't be a good idea to mention this in the label of the drugs. So after 1990, psychiatry is now in the position of having the honor of hosting the greatest known divide between the data when we access it and the claims in publications. You'd have thought with 45 negative trials, these drugs wouldn't be used to treat children who are depressed, but antidepressants are now the second most commonly taken meds by teenage girls. So even though schizophrenia is disappearing and postpartum psychosis is disappearing, business will go on. But the challenge to us as a profession is to work out, well, where do we stand in all this? Is it good enough just to be in business, or what are we doing? For insurers and managers and politicians, the idea that the art in medicine is bringing good out of the use of a poison does not compute. It cannot be standardized. And that's where the clash lies. And equally, Greta's generation are not going to support us in this. They will trample over us to get access to meds like this. So it's an intriguing issue about how we're going to move forward from here. Thank you very much.